Right. So you're able to see the screen, hear me okay now, isn't it? No distortion and
yeah, I can hear you perfectly.
Okay,
no
that's great.
Whatsoever.
Good stuff. So in today's session, what we're going to be looking at is covering Learning Outcome 3. And in Learning Outcome 3, if I just magnify it slightly just to make it much more clear. So in Learning Outcome 3, if I go back just very briefly, in the first one, we looked at basically, the management theories, the behavioral models of management, leadership, style, those four basic theories and the 5 different, quadrants that we draw up when we talk about the scientific experiment, the great man theory, the bureaucratic and, Max Weber's theory and things like that. Now, in the second one, we basically went into, so now we understand management, leadership, various behavioral theories, leadership theories, management styles. We went into understanding what are organizational structures, how does the structure of the organization influence the culture within the organization. And then we looked at how organizations look at building an effective culture, because most businesses today or multinationals today, they operate across different geographies and different continents. So here there is an increasing importance on diversity, and we looked at how the structure of the organization, when we talk about different types, matrix, hybrid, flat, functional, geographical or hierarchical structures, and there could be many in terms of combinations, and how do they influence the culture of the organization. And now what we are going to do in the third learning outcome, after understanding the styles of management and leadership, and then culture and structure, so we're going to go into understanding how the culture, style, management structure, and the organizational structure overall influence the performance of the employees within the organization, and how do managers and leaders look at improving employees' performance in order to ensure that the work gets done at the end of the day, they are productive, they're efficient, they're achieving or working towards achieving the organizational goals and objectives. And this particular learning outcome 3 has 3 assessment criteria that we're going to be looking at covering. So one of them is going to be looking at assessing the impact of the learning, why learning or training and development, if I put the other word, is important to increase the effectiveness of employees in order to increase skills, knowledge, and overall, let's say the overall, the learning part of the organization in order to enhance skills. Why is it important? The second bit that we're going to be looking at is understanding teams. And when we talk about teams, we'll be looking at, how team working in certain organizations. When we look at call centers, services organization, we look at manufacturing, production, engineering, retail. There are lots of sectors in which teams are quite important, and obviously a lot of work within the organization actually gets done in teams. So we'll be looking at how teams, how teams are formed, when are they formed, and how do teams in general look at improving employee performance. So why do managers group people into teams? And why do they give them tasks which are large tasks or bigger tasks broken into smaller tasks, and they are asked to be accomplished or completed as teams? And in the last, what we're going to be looking at is analyzing basically the first part, which is 3.1. But in this case, we're going to be looking at maybe 1 or 2 models to try and understand, how can the overall effectiveness of the organization can be improved. And when we talk about performance management techniques, PMTs in particular, we're going to be looking at understanding things like key performance indicators, balance score, business, when we talk about balance scorecard from a business point of view, we look at things which are related to management by objectives, MBO as we call it. So we are going to be looking at some of the more established models and techniques which are basically used by managers and leaders essentially to overall increase the effectiveness of the employees in terms of the organization. As always, I've got a few deck of slides that we're going to be looking into in order to cover this particular learning outcome. And we will start off with looking at some of the key terms which are involved in the assessment criteria. So some of the keywords or buzzwords, as I would call it, we'll look at understanding them, and then we'll go into a bit more detail by looking into each of the assessment criteria. Now, when we look at, improved employee effectiveness, when we talk about improvement, there are a couple of things which come to your mind. So one of the, if we look at synonyms or we look at buzzwords which come to your mind when we talk about improvement, when we talk about performance, when we talk about, delivering on time or meeting the targets or objectives or SMART goals, there are lots of things which come to your mind, but more or less they are related to, understanding what managers and leaders would look at. And they would look at how can the work be completed by looking at ingenious ways of, getting things done within the organization without making it mundane and cumbersome. So when we look at innovation and creativity, this is one of the things which most leaders and managers look at in order to bring within their teams and their, colleagues and peers, because this allows them to, look at the same thing that they've been doing for a number of years, but through a new, or let's say from a very different angle. And when we talk about creation and innovative, innovation and creativity, these are things which basically differentiate how organizations perform, how people or individuals within team perform. So when you look at teams which are given freedom, they are given the basic requisites to be able to perform and obviously deliver on tasks. You would generally see, sometimes individuals will come up with, in very meritorious or creative ideas, which will be looking at solving problems and issues within the organization. And when we talk about this, most successful organizations cultivate an atmosphere of, innovation and creativity. And this is where they try and give employees the free hand, or let's say, when we talk about in general free hand, but when we look at specifically things like, empowerment, which leads to, decision making, and this allows them to look at, bringing in their own ideas and their own, ways of doing things, which sometimes, can be beneficial for the organization. That is where it leads to newer business models, improved productiveness, or looking at making things work through the more, or better ways of efficiency can be achieved. And that is where this is very closely related to what we say is the organizational culture. So sometimes organizations cultivate the habit of developing and promoting innovation and creativity, and this allows the organizations to prosper, not just from a point of view of getting the derived benefits of giving more empowerment to their employees, but also from a point of view of allowing them to make decisions and bring across or bring out newer ways through which they can look at accomplishing the same tasks or roles and responsibilities which have been given. Or the other one of the we will look at is going to be a key term that we will use, will be related to what is called performance. Now, in general, when we look at the meaning of the word, performance, in terms of, let's say, the literal meaning, you would normally, find the definition of the word performance as something which is, performing, or something which is creating an action, or it's a function which allows you to create action or, complete a task. So when we look at as managers, when we look at as supervisors, when we have the responsibility to be able to manage people, or we are responsible for managing people, then in those cases, sometimes indirectly or indirectly, you become responsible for ensuring that the output required is actually achieved. So when managers look at, say, let's say, they look at financial metrics, things like, the P&L, they look at manpower cost, or they look at cost per department or cost of the function in relative to the department, and what one particular person is bringing to the table in terms of, are they carrying their weight, as they say, are you able to pull your weight through? So when we look at hearing such sentences or phrases, we are basically referring to, is the employee or is the staff or is a colleague actually performing to the required standards? So one of the ways through which, when we look at appraisals which happen at the end of the year, and that exercise on an activity which happens at the departmental level, if you're a manager at your level with your colleagues or superiors, and in some cases at a departmental level when the HR manager also sits, the key criteria for measurement and how the employee or the staff or colleague has done throughout the year in terms of its roles and responsibility and the implementation or execution of it is actually measured in terms of output. And that output would be termed as performance. So it's a key parameter which managers essentially use, even leaders they use, and in those cases there might be qualitative parameters, but in the case of managers there would be quantitative parameters because required to ensure that the P&L is sustainable. They're required to ensure that the roles and responsibilities are fulfilled, and in this case the idea is that the organization is looking at measuring the output, and that output would be measured in terms of performance. Now that performance as a measurement matrix for managers would be key performance indicators. So are you showing the key qualities or the key requirements to be able to achieve those targets? So they become a combination of qualitative and the qualitative and quantitative. And when you rise higher in the organizations, you are going to be managed more on KPIs or key performance indicators. So for example, if you're a product manager, or for example, you are a department manager, or you're a sales manager or a regional manager, in those cases, you'd be measured on what are called the KPIs. Are you hitting the right notes? Are you able to, manage the team? Are you able to grow the market share? Are you able to pull through in terms of sales or the targets which are required? Are you able to, cover that revenue from sales? So key performance indicators. So they tend to be, we look at objectives, and at senior level, they will become KPIs. And at the board level or a senior management level, when I say the top management, sometimes you would look at the option of what is then called the balance scorecard. And in those cases, what tends to be happening is that this becomes a bit of a framework in which, the top management or the senior management of the organization is basically, managed through some 4, broad parameters. And they tend to be, financial, business processes, let's say, customer orientation and, feedback from customer. And last but not the least, looking at how the management is able to build the organizational capacity, which is the organization being geared enough, or is the leadership gearing up with the organization to deliver on those objectives? So they look at organizational capacity, and sometimes you would see leaders would be focused on building capacity when the business starts to run or the business starts to produce, meaningful results after being a startup, or if in those cases, if it's a startup business, it will be maybe after a point in time when the business is stabilized and is generating, let's say, the word that I want to use is continuous, and, let's say, there is a steady revenue stream which the business is producing, then the leaders will be focusing on building the organizational capacity, which is to increase the throughput. And that is where they will be measured on what is called the balance scorecard. So you look at a basic aspect of a 360-degree appraisal. So you are going to be appraised by the customer, by the organization. You're going to be looking at being appraised by, your business partners and suppliers. You'll be looking at the business processes which are within the organization, and ultimately the responsibility from a budgetary point of view, financial point of view, would be also, a key player in terms of how your appraisals, or, how you're seen to be performing within the organization. Now, this particular method that we look at, in particular, when we talk about these performance metrics, KPIs, MBOs, balance scorecard, appraisals, we're going to cover that in a bit more detail in the subsequent slides. But just as an example, this particular method was created by, Kaplan and Norton. And when we talk about them, balance scorecard and how they created this in the early 1950s, they had adopted this and built it up like a framework. And at some stages, what they did was this, then in the 60s and 70s, and then in the early 90s, it was adopted by several organizations for the measurement, or as a barometer to be able to measure the performance of the top management. And that is where it was then also referred to as what is called the BSC, balance scorecard approach. And this then allowed organizations to build robust frameworks which allowed the employee appraisals at various levels to happen, considering the 4 broader aspects of which the organization works on. So organizational objectives, financials, customer, and looking at, the business processes. So we'll cover this in a bit more detail, but generally, If I look at as an example, Shell, which is a very large, conglomerate, specifically in the oil and petroleum industry, they adopted this as an approach within their appraisal system in the early 1990s. And what they do is they structure the salary of the employees on the basis of their achievements, which are quantified, related to parameters like customer satisfaction, looking at business processes, and also the revenue that they're able to get and basically, generate by doing the activities that are given as a part and parcel of their roles and responsibilities. Now, one of the other things that we will also note, which is going to be important for us from a point of view of when we understand performance and when we understand working of organization, is that a lot of leaders sometimes and a lot of managers sometimes look at making changes within the organization, and these changes are normally implemented to either increase performance, build capacity. It is also done primarily to adapt to competitors in the market, and in some cases, dynamic market changing conditions which require these change processes to be implemented and require that change to be adopted by the organization for them to be, say, in line with what the market requirements are, customer requirements are, and also maybe to counteract what the competitors are doing in the market. So when we talk about performance, you will also see that sometimes we also parallelly talk hand in hand with regards to what is called change, and this change is central to most organizations, because there are processes which change over point in time. There are people which come and go. Staff turnover happens within organizations, and when we look at the process of change and the implementation of this change happening within the organization, you would generally see that this becomes quite important for us to study and have knowledge about, because at some stage in your career and at some stage when you work within organizations, if you are a manager, you are going to be tasked with bringing across change or embracing change because the organization is changing or the structure is changing. If the organization is undergoing merger and acquisition, is being taken over by another organization, sometimes the organizations look at downsizing. If the market conditions are not that good, economic downturns happen, and that is where the organization needs to survive. What they look at doing is downsizing. That means they will trim the excess.
Hello? Yes.
Criteria or functions which we feel are not going to be relevant for the organization in the short to mid time frame will be looked at, reorganizing. So in those cases, we see change happening. So when we talk about change is also related to improving, the focus, or maybe let's say the efficiency within the organization. New processes are introduced. Sometimes you would see training is done to introduce new tools and techniques. Training could be done for sales guys. Training could be done for customer service. And the whole idea of doing these through the process of training is to help improve the efficiency when you do certain repetitive jobs on a day in, day out basis. And that allows, the management to help build competency and obviously reskill the staff within the organization. So when we will study about change, we will study 2 or 3 key models that we need to be aware of, and they tend to be, Kurt Levin's freezing, unfreezing, and refreezing model, and we look at the Kotter's 8-step change model, which is normally used by organizations or people within, senior leadership or management within the organization when they need to look at bringing across change because of reorganization or restructuring, or you're looking at, in some cases, restructuring. So when you're looking at restructuring, reorganization, mergers and acquisition, downsizing, and in those cases, you would see change is very important, and change is then also related to, on the other side, with what is called, performance and performance management. Why do you need to bring across change? Because the team is not performing. Why do you need to reorganize the team or reskill or retrain the team? Because the skills required to do this particular job or this particular project or this particular, set of responsibilities, they do not have the skills. So you have to reskill the employees by looking at bringing in training and development, and that is where change would come in, and that change would then improve and help improve the productivity and efficiency or help let them gain skills, which will then allow them to achieve those objectives. So change management is an important process within the organization, and it is always related to some way or the other to performance, or in some cases when the organization is looking at reorganizing, restructuring, you would generally see that this is a key section or a component of when we talk about measurement, when we talk about performance, productivity, efficiency, output in general, if we say, and in general related to, you know, how the organization overall performs with regards to its competition. So any questions on this so far?
Yeah, I think it's great.
Okay, so when we look at now some of the assessment criteria, the first one that we normally talk about, you know, which is given in the unit specification, that basically looks at assessing the impact of learning. So one of the key things that we look at when we look at change, and organizations, when they implement change, they are looking at implementing change because they want to look at improving performance. So when we talk about learning as one of the key cogs within this wheel, we look at how learning impacts on the organization in terms of helping either to reskill, or everybody singing from the same songbook, or everybody having, you know, the skills which are required to be able to give their 100% or in terms of output when they look at doing those roles and functions. Now, one of the things that we look at when we talk about organizational learning, Peter Senge is the, you know, Dr. Peter Senge is actually credited with, you know, doing a lot of work within this field, and he came up with this concept and idea of what is called the learning organization. Now, when he talked about this particular idea, he had a singular vision that when organizations put together a group of people in a team and they are tasked with doing or accomplishing certain jobs or you know, tasks, they tend to continuously work together, and the working of those individuals can be productive if they have the capabilities to be able to deliver on that role or on that particular task. So here he focused on the fact that sometimes if you train employees and you look at continuously enhancing their capabilities, which is basically skills, this allows the organization to create, you know, knowledge and also, you know, skills, which are then, you know, spread between the teams, and that allows the organizations to achieve the objectives. So in short, he came up with the framework, which is called, you know, the learning organization. And in learning organization, when we talk about it, we talk about, you know, the 5 ways through which he proposed in his framework that the learning can happen within the organization. And these 5 ways that he proposed is called the 5th discipline, or, you know, what he coined as, you know, in his journal when he published this, or his book actually when it was published in the 1990s, he called it the learning organization. And the 5 pillars of the learning organization tend to be system thinking, personal mastery, team learning, mental models, and shared vision. So he's basically proposed these 5 different routes which allow organizations to create, you know, learning within the organization, and learning leads to the creation of knowledge or shared knowledge amongst colleagues, and that shared knowledge among colleagues basically enhances capability, and this enhancement in capability allows the organizations to be highly effective and highly productive, depending on the field and depending on the sector in which these organizations are essentially working. Now, subsequent slides, if I quickly summarize, would basically look at covering these 5 different, you know, dimensions that he's proposed, which should be there in a learning organization. So first, he proposed what is called systems thinking. And systems thinking basically looks at, you know, in terms of how effectively the organization utilizes systems and how interconnected they are in the organization, which allows, you know, continuous flow of communication. Highly effective communication can happen, and this allows, you know, let's say the key bits being sharing of information to happen. So most organizations today deployed some sort of technology, and this technology or technological platforms kind of allow the systems thinking, bit to happen within most organizations. The second bit that he talked about was what is called personal mastery. Now, the second dimension of personal mastery focuses on that learning starts with the individual. That means at each level, employees and their skills would be important. And if we are to look at, enhancing the skills of a particular employee so that they are able to perform to their utmost maximum within the role and responsibility that they are given, this would allow the organization to benefit as a whole. And he explained this, that sometimes, employees, when they are given tasks or jobs, they try and achieve personal mastery on that particular job. So you would see within organizations, there are people who are specialists on certain functions. And why do we see them as being specialists on specific areas or functions is because they've worked for a number of years within the same function, with the same responsibility, and this allows them to build experience, and that experience then leads to the creation of knowledge, and this allows the individual to perform exceedingly well when such tasks are set for them individually. So some part of the learning can be at the personal level, and in those cases the organization should be able to support the employee looking at achieving mastery in a particular trait, particular function, or a responsibility. Then we talk about what are called the mental models. Now, there are various mental models which have come up over the years, and this particular dimension that he talked about when he came up with what is called the mental models was related to the fact that he basically said that within the organization, sometimes you would see that a lot of people come with a lot of different ingrained assumptions. And when we talk about assumptions, generalizations, you would generally see that this tends to influence how we understand, things which happen around us, and how do we get influenced by those things which happen around us. And sometimes that allows, certain actions to be taken within the organization, which might not look or feel, let's say right, but in some cases, what tends to happen is that because this is an experience which the person has gone through and has had that experience of going through that particular, way to solve the problem, then sometimes you would see is that the organization would look at learning from those experiences and then basically applying them to certain situations when they are faced with that in the future. Now, this essentially has one or two drawbacks. One or two drawbacks meaning sometimes when problems are faced, what organizations do is they look inwards to solve those problems rather than taking consultancy or help from outside. But they look at inwards to solve some of those problems because there will be people who have gone through the similar phases or similar set of problems during a particular phase within the organization, and that is what they try and do is try and unbundle those problems with looking at behaviors and skill sets which have been accumulated within the organization. So in this case, what we generally see is that sometimes they will look at implementing or coming out with solutions which might not be the most ideal solutions for the organization, and that is where this tends to be a bit of a it has a plus and a positive and a negative side of it. The other thing that we also look at is when we talk about let's say the the aspect of how typically you would see the organization would like to solve a particular problem. So in those cases, what most leaders and managers try and do is they look at building a shared vision. If they are looking at making the organizational prosperous, they are looking at from a long-term perspective. So in some cases, what he proposed was one of the dimensions which is very important is to look at building a shared vision. That means it allows managers and leaders to basically position an idea about leadership, or say for example about what the organization ethos is, and then such vision which they kind of establish allows with that vision, what they do is they also empower the employees, which allows them to essentially believe in that particular vision, and it encourages what is called experimentation and innovation. And this is what we get to see in companies like Apple, Google, Facebook, which have come out with, dramatic different products, over the years. And why this is happening is because the leaders have instilled that particular bit within the organization of, believing in what is called, the reason why the organization exists, and making sure that their messaging is as close as possible to the mission and vision of the organization, so that everybody has a similar understanding. And when we look at this, coupled with empowerment that they give on decision making processes, allows the development of organization from a creative point of view. So what it sees is, when you look at so what I'm trying to say is, basically, here is an example. If you look at a lot of organizations which bring out products and services, you generally see that there are lots of teams which work on different products and services. And in some cases, you would see there is a lot of experimentation which goes on. So sometimes there are competing teams coming up with models, but only one model will see the light of the day, and the other teams would primarily be only contributing towards that competitive nature of bringing out, something quite innovative. And this is where leaders play and managers play a very critical role, is because they allow this particular ability and aspect to be let's say ingrained within the organization, by building a shared vision which allows them to understand that the organization, this is the basic ethos of the organization, this is what it stands for, this is what the organization needs to do in terms of being relevant in the market space. And that allows employees the ability to be able to experiment and look at innovative ideas, which is done through delegation and power sharing. And that is where this dimension is quite important. The last one that you talked about was team learning. Go on, sorry, Saman. Any questions?
No, but I just had one question. Sorry to interrupt. I was listening to mental models. It's basically the bias we will all have. And I just want to know, what can the managers do to avoid that bias?
So when we look at the bias, which basically can be influenced because of the, ingrained experiences or assumptions or generalization which an employee might have because they've gone through a similar experience or have had number of years of experience. So in those cases, normally you would see leaders and managers overcoming that particular bias is when they basically look at building a bit of a repertoire, or build a particular relationship with the individual to understand where they are coming from, what assumptions they have, and why do they show these particular behaviors. And when we look at that bit of managers and leaders trying to understand where the individual is actually coming from and why they are exhibiting this particular behavior, it allows them to basically mold them to, let's say, understand their perspective and organizational perspective. And what they do is they try and play a balancing role in terms of, making certain inquiries, but also at the same time advocating certain types of, behavior which they would want to see within the individual, rather than, just dominating them and basically saying, no, do it this way or do it that way. So in short, when we look at overcoming objections, when we look at, for example, overcoming hurdles in terms of mental blocks, when employees show personal biases, then in those cases, the managers would look at, using these models which have been developed. And when I say these models, what they will do is they'll fall back onto policy and procedure which have been set within the organization, and they would look at balancing that, rationale by applying that policy and procedure to what the objection of the individual or the the employee is, and then try and look at let's say inquiring and also informing, and in some cases advocating that this would be the way forward, and that would be through the process of either training, it would be through the process of maybe looking at helping to develop new skills. Training could be to improve skills, but when we look at training to develop new skills, that would be a new that will be a different orientation from a point of view of training and development. So when I use the word development, what I would mean is if you're good at something, we're going to help you develop that to a next level, and that would be development. But when I talk about training, or when I talk about learning, under training and development, learning would be that the managers would work with the understanding that this is where this is what the bias is, this is where the individual comes from in terms of its present or current behavior, but this behavior would be best channelized by looking at planning, or allowing the employee to do training, which would help in the development of new skills, and these development of new skills would then allow the development of new orientation within the employee's mindset, and that would allow the employee to embrace change or adjust to that change which they are trying to, let's say, bring about or overcome in terms of an objection. Is that okay?
Yeah, I understand.
So,
yes, I understand.
So when we talk about, in general, if I look at a practical example, if you're a manager, and obviously you come up with certain objections when you say, okay, this month we need to achieve this much target, or this month we need to roll out these many models out of production line. You generally see the approaches tend to be a couple. One, there is open communication. That means you would try and reason out why this is something which you are not able to accept, or why do you think that we are not going to be able to meet that target. And in those cases, what tends to come up as objections tend to be either lack of resources, lack of training, or lack of knowledge, or lack of, spend in some cases, like marketing budget and things. So that would be one. Second would be looking at understanding, things which the employee or the staff is aware of and the organization might not be aware of. So that might come from market intelligence, because the employee who's front-ending certain functions for the organization might have more knowledge, and the practical knowledge side of things from meeting customers might be different from what the organization has as experience or as assumptions within the organization. This works or this does not work. Might be that the employee would be able to better inform the organization. And the third would be a negotiation or a mediation, which tends to happen when we try and find a middle ground by looking at where the employee is coming from and what learning skills, or information and knowledge that the person has, and what the organization is having in terms of its internal structure and processes, and where they can meet in the middle. So there is a bit of a coordination. There's a bit of a negotiation which tends to happen, and that allows this mental, block to be removed. So either the managers would agree to certain aspects of what the employees are saying, or in some cases the employees would be looking at being put into training and redevelopment in order to better their skills, so that they are able to adapt to the changing landscape which the organization wants them to look into and finally perform. Now, one of the last dimensions, very briefly, he talked about was team learning. Now, he talks about that, sometimes within organizations we get to see that because of the collaborative environment that we have, and people with work within teams, you see sometimes learning tends to happen quite quickly. So when you're asked to shadow, when you are asked to be a mentor, or when you are coached by senior employees within the organization in order to transfer skills, in order to help develop skills, you would see that is where he referred to as the fifth dimension. The fifth side was that team learning is important. So sometimes you would see, senior employees are asked to shadow or basically mentor, upcoming performing employees within the organization. And this is primarily done to align and help develop capabilities within the team as a second tier or as a structure within the organization, so that they are able to achieve desired results. And this allows the people to also move up in their role or move up within the organization. And then when we see people working together, they also see that sometimes working together also leads to learning together, and learning together tends to be good, because in those cases it speeds up the whole process of sharing, learning, and in terms of development, and this allows the capacity of the organization overall to be increased. Now, capacity might be general when I'm referring to here, but it could be increasing overall, the knowledge, skill set, and because the employees are performing better, because they're learning together, that would mean the overall capacity to a certain extent from a output point of view tends to, increase within the organization. So one of these bits that we talk about in terms of learning organization is quite important, because Peter French actually came up with this concept, and he then defined this as the 5 different dimensions of what we see as a learning organization. Then we also have parallel views. When we talk about parallel views, within the organization, we talk about when we look at, certain other scientists, philosophers, and, people who did work from a point of view of, looking at how learning and development can happen within the organization. One of the views that we normally think and talk about are the views of Garrett. And Garrett learning, basically, he came about with this concept wherein he basically talks about that in order for the organization to survive and in certain cases to grow, learning part of it is very important. And, most HR departments, most managers and leaders should not ignore this as a function within the organization. So in order for the organization to grow continuously and be relevant within the market, what he basically meant was that, he said that this is something which is going to be very important for the organization, and this should not be actually ignored at all levels, and specifically within the, management and leadership level. So he came about with a parallel view that most organizations need to look at some sort of way of formal learning, and there could be informal learning. So he proposed 2 different views, that when employees are put together or asked to do training, like if you're asked to go and attend a seminar or you're asked to go and attend a 3-day workshop, then this is a formal training process which the organization is instituting, and this should help you directly or indirectly in terms of doing your day-to-day job. Now, the other thing that he proposed was that there is informal learning which also happens, and this happens at the individual level, at the team level. And if you put together individuals, or like-minded individuals into teams, then you would generally see this type of informal learning is also, quite beneficial for the organization. And what you would see in practical sense would be that when we talk about his view, Garrett's and Moderna's view, what they said is that sometimes the organizations, if you see in a practical example, if I give you, what happens is if you're a large organization and you're invited, you work with a lot of partners and suppliers, or you are working with a lot of different companies, what sometimes happens is when there are conferences and seminars or workshops which happen, they will normally invite 1 or 2 members. So they will send an invite out to the top management and say, okay, would you nominate 1 or 2 people to come in and attend this particular workshop, which is going to be important. And a case in point, an example that I would give you is when you look at large organizations which look at building basic components, you look at, Taiwan Semiconductors, you look at Intel, for example, you look at ARM processors. So when they bring out, or you look at NVIDIA, for example, when they bring out new products, now their products are not bought directly by consumers in the market. Their products are actually integrated into some of the other electronics which the consumers buy. So when they come out with new products, what they would tend to do is they would hold conferences, workshops globally. And what happens is they invite some of these principals and the team from their organization to come in and participate in these workshops. And they tend to be running as developer workshops or, large conferences which are run 3-day, 5-day, depending on, what they are looking at accomplishing. So what happens is the organization would nominate 1 or 2 top sales managers or 1 or 2 top people to go from the organization. When they go and attend, they will attend on behalf of the organization, but the knowledge and the information that they will gather, when they come back, what they're asked to do is do an internal training for the other employees or relevant people who would work within those teams within the organization. So sometimes you see this process happening wherein 1 or 2 people are invited or a team is invited, and that team, when it comes back from that training conference workshop, they will train the internal employees of the organization. And that is where he said that, informal learning also needs to be looked at when we look at organizations, looking at surviving and obviously growing in the increasingly competitive world. Then we also talk about the views of Payne and Whitaker. Now, Payne and Whitaker basically proposed an ideology which says lifelong learning. Now they say that, learning cannot be sporadic within the organization. Learning has to be continuous as a process. And sometimes you would see that the only way organizations would be able to build this process of learning within the organization would be through the concept of what is called lifelong learning. Now, a good example of this would be when we look at General Electric, GE in particular, which is a very large US company. And you see that within the organization has defined this within their, employee manual or handbook to say that all employees joining the organization have to do a minimum number of trainings throughout the year. And they have what is called a technological portal or a portal within the organization which allows organizations to do internal trainings. And in those cases, managers, various department heads, function heads can actually nominate their colleagues or peers within their department to do specific or mandatory trainings in order to develop skills which are required for them to better do their day-to-day jobs. And what the organization also promotes is the process of certification. So when you do training, you get rewarded, wherein you are basically formally rewarding them by issuing a certificate, which could be used as a let's say as a leverage when the individual says, I've done so many years of training, or I've done so many different trainings, or I've attended so many different trainings. So this formally tends to be recognized from a point of view of ensuring that all employees within the organization need to do certain amount of trainings every year. Like in General Electric, when you look at call center and some of the other functions, you would generally see that most employees are required to do about 2 or 3 trainings a month. So on an average, they're required to do about 25 certification courses throughout the year. And over the years, what the organization has done is they've made it mandatory for all employees working at a certain level to complete Six Sigma training, which is the quality standard which most US companies follow. So GE was the first one who was instrumental in introducing the concept of Six Sigma, and they made it mandatory for most of their employees to be at some stage to do this training and have this Six Sigma belt or the black belt in Six Sigma as a quality mark, which was required from the individual. So here the view of Payne and Whitaker, when we see, is actually being implemented within organizations like GE. You look at Walmart, which basically follow a process through which they have portals, technology portals within the organization, and that allows the workforce to be continuously trained, and trainings are a central part of the company's philosophy. Then we look at Burgoyne's and his colleagues' view, and his colleagues' view was that they recognize the importance of learning, which is required within the organization. But what they also said that when we look at learning, which is required, to achieve organizational effectiveness, they identified what are called the key benefits which the training also needs to deliver to the employees in order for them to become more productive. So they came up with the view that when you look at employees doing training, the training would give employees more knowledge and power, and what that would also do on the other side would be that it will empower employees to basically ask for change. So in those cases, when we look at one of the key benefits that they came up with in their proposition was that when change has to be done within the organization, one of the best ways to instill and start the process of change is through the process of individual learning or learning at the organizational level. And this change, this learning, which basically leads to the increased knowledge and development of skills, allows individuals to better adapt to the change which the organization is looking at bringing about to either become competitive, become more efficient, or, in general, become more, let's say, productive. And their view is closely mapped to, looking at the balanced scorecard view, wherein they said that in order for this effectiveness to be measured, and if we say learning leads to effectiveness or improvement in performance, we need to look at some of the other aspects of, how training and learning basically helps the employees, better those aspects. and that is where their aim was to basically say that when organizations are actually looking at let's say bringing more efficiency into the organization, then in those cases they would want to basically make sure that the learning side of things, which can be done within the organization, also empower the individuals to be able to ask for change. And when that kind of a empowerment tends to happen, then you would also see that employees would then be looking at, let's say, asking for more let's say deliverables from the organization, because they expect the organization to also deliver on some of their requirements, like maybe higher bonuses, higher salaries, or higher emoluments, or perks, as we call them. And that is where this particular model or the this particular approach was quite helpful. So in this particular task that we are looking at, we are looking at understanding the impact of learning. And how would you understand the impact of learning is by putting together views of different groups central to Peter Senge, which have proposed the concept of learning organization, and putting across those views and then agreeing to one in particular. How would that help in the organization or the employees becoming more effective? Would basically be looking at dealing with the process of this particular aspect of assessment and the learning part of it within the organization. Is that okay?
Yes, everything's right.
Okay, good stuff. So there is a particular handout which I'm going to share, which is related to understanding the various models which have been proposed over the years. And these models that we look at, would give you a bit more detail into why there is so much focus given on learning within the organization. And if I just briefly show the handout, which I'm going to say or provide, is this particular handout which says Models of Organizational Learning. And this basically captures the work which has been done over the years, in the process of OL, or organizational learning. And they will basically summarize all the individual models and give you more details. So what we've basically considered in the PowerPoint slides is basically the various views of the authors, and the scientists which have done work on this particular concept. But the models which have come out and what are actually reflected in when we talk about learning within the organization are going to be covered in this particular handout. And this is for additional reading, because what we want to be able to do is, as managers at some stage, when you have to implement learning or training and development within the organization, you would not normally need to align with one particular model depending on the structure and culture within the organization. And that is what you would generally see working in a particular organization. So there's no one model which fits all. And generally you see in the 21st century, the e-flow model of learning, which is where the technology is being used in order to deliver training across departments, and obviously through the route of through the use of technological advancements, things like intranets, which you get to see within organizations. We see training portals within organizations would be the ones that would be helpful from a practical perspective in today's organization. Okay, the second aspect that we are looking at very briefly is evaluate how working in teams can improve, effectiveness. So there are a couple of things that we would clearly look at. One is that when we talk about team, do you know what is the definition of team?
A collective group of people working on the same goal?
Yeah, so together everyone achieves more. This is one of the most acceptable acronyms, when we talk about teams. So when we talk about team means together everyone will achieve more. So the whole idea of organization actually putting together individuals into a particular task or a project is from an aspect that they're trying to achieve more as a group, rather than individuals achieving their individual targets. So sometimes you would see within, sales teams, within marketing teams, within production and engineering teams, R&D teams, there'll be a number of people working together on different projects. And the idea there is that the management and the leadership is basically looking at ensuring that, as a collective, they are able to achieve the objectives much quicker and sooner with lesser resources, or, lesser spend on resources being done. Now, in order to instill this particular, strength within the organizations, what mostly managers and leaders focus on is, when they look at putting people together in teams, they're looking at certain objectives. So what is certain objectives? If you imagine a company doing a product launch, and a product launch has to be done in a number of locations, you would generally see a large team being formed, which will be a temporary team, but that project team will be responsible for pretty much taking end-to-end all the decisions and rolling out, product launches in different cities or in different countries, if you look at it this way. So teams would be able, or people, when they're grouped together into teams, will be able to achieve more because they have the authority. In some cases, they're also delegated more power, and because they know and exactly know each other quite well, because they've worked in the past or they have been part and parcel of the same department, there is a bit of dependency, understanding, a relationship which tends to instill between these individuals which are pulled together to form this team. You would see that they show certain characteristics. So they are going to be able to work together quite quickly. They are able to understand that, we are not required to step on each other's toes. They know when their work starts, when their work finishes. They know very clearly when to hand over, when to ask for help. And in some cases, you would also see that some of these individuals, because they have worked together in the past a number of times, allows them to, work with healthy competition. And because of the relationship that they've developed over the years of working together, that allows them to also efficiently work or cover each other's, let's say, work when somebody is looking at, either falling through or is overburdened with work. Now, when we talk about different team models, there are a couple of models that we need to talk about. Now, one of the first models that we talk about is, let me start with the Tuckman's model of team building. This is the framework model which basically Bruce Tuckman came up with in the 1960s, and he came up with 4 stages that if you try and put individuals together into a team, what will happen is they'll go through 4 phases initially, and then he came up with the 5th phase at a later stage. So the 4 phases that they will go through before they start working as a team follow through a particular process. So the first phase is, when you get a group of individuals together, there is a stage called forming. That means there is a lot of disagreement, there is a lot of interaction, but the interaction also leads to disagreement because they're not able to conform with each other in terms of what role they want to do or what experience they have, and why do you think that I'm not suitable for this role. So there's a lot of initial discussion on how to put teams together, and that is what managers look at when they look at CVs, previous experience. They look at how you've been performing or what tasks you have done or what part and parcel of teams you have been in the past. So this stage is where managers pull together, or leaders pull together people from different departments to form a team. The second stage is storming, which is a lot of disagreements. There is a lot of, let's say team members do not understand each other quite well. They are very clear, they're stubborn, for example, to a certain extent, and they ask or question the rationale of why they've been put together in a team and why they've been asked to do this function. So there is a lot of discussion and disagreement which tends to happen in this stage, wherein everybody tries to assert their role or their experience or their background to take up a particular role that they want to take while working within the team. The third phase tends to be norming, wherein everybody then calms down. They realize that, okay, this is something which is an overarching objective that we've been asked to come together to work on, and then they start accepting the roles which have been given. Okay, say I'll align with you, or I'll work with you, or okay, I will be able to take up this job. So they start accepting the roles that they are being provided to work within this team for a particular project, or for a particular role that they've been brought together. And then in the last stage, which he proposed, is that when this calm, confidence, and relationship starts to build, that is where the team starts to actually perform. So they start performing as a unison or a single unit, and that is where they are able to then singly align towards achieving a common goal. They are no longer worried about that I need to achieve or you need to achieve or will you be able to achieve. they start working together as a team. Now, the fifth stage was added up later in 1977 when they came up with a stage called adjourning. That means you would generally see that if teams are formed at some point in time, the teams could also be adjourned. That means they could be dismantled, or once the project or the tasks have been achieved or the responsibility has been executed, you would see sometimes teams are also disbanded. And that fifth stage is when the members actually go back to doing their usual functions, would be called the adjourning stage. So this was one of the first models which was proposed for team building, and it's called the Tuckman's model. Now, where is this model suitable? Now, we will study a couple of models that we have in the slide. I'll quickly go through them. But the key point here is that this model is suited where people understand the various stages of how teams are going to be made, and when they are put together in teams, and what are the objectives of them getting or being put together in teams. So when you look at project teams, when you look at construction industry in general, you generally see that there are lots of different types of people which are brought together into the team. So you'll have architectural engineers, you'll have mechanical engineers, electronic engineers, you'll have surveyors, lots of different types of people which are brought together into a team. And they all understand their role and function in terms of why they've been brought across. So maybe a company is building a flyover or a skyscraper or a big office complex. They know what their role is going to be. But you would generally see this team model being functional and best suited in certain situations, because here the people understand the various stages of how the team is going to be built, what projects and tasks they are going to be given, and in those cases, this model tends to be successful. Then we look at the Kattenbach and Smith model. Now, in this particular model, when they proposed, they said that teams are fine, but how do we build effective teams? So when in the 1990s they proposed this particular model, they were looking at, how teams could be effective. That means they could be performing teams, they could be teams which are able to complement each other in terms of skills and jobs which are required to be done, and they are more accountable. So there is not a case of blame game which tends to happen. And when they proposed this particular model, what they said was that in order for teams to be efficient and productive, they need to come up they came up with this particular, 5 levels of teamwork which they want to see within a team. And that is where this model makes perfect sense. So when you look at, teams performing as, not as, say, for example, individuals performing individual tasks and then that is being clubbed as a group task, but the other way around, wherein the team members are operating as individuals and their tasks that they do would form, say, for example, some sort of a basic task, or an output of their task will become the input of somebody else's task. So here the work model is very clearly defined. So if you look at the car production line, for example, you generally see the car production line starts off with a particular way. It starts off with chassis, then it goes for painting. Then once the chassis rolls out onto the floor, you would see different teams working on the car as the production line is going or rolling through the car is rolling through the production line. Different teams working on different aspects. Some of the teams or in group of individuals are working on the upholstery. Some are working on the engine. Some are working on the exterior of the car. Some are working on the interior of the car, attachments, other instrumentation and things like that. So you would see that this kind of a model tends to work when an input to a particular team or a group becomes the output for another particular team, and so on and so forth. So here the main part is that you see the roles being very clearly defined at the individual level, and each individual knows where my task starts and where my task finishes. And that is where they propose that if it is arranged in this particular fashion, you would generally see teams not just working, but teams being very effective. Now, in this particular model, what we do get to see is that they define, when they get together individuals, they will look at getting individuals with 3 basic aspects. One is skills, second is accountability, and the third is commitment. So if you look at this particular triangle, which we get to see in this Kattenbach and Smith model, you would generally see that when managers put together this kind of a team, they are trying to put together people which have high skill or good amount of skills. They have very good commitment towards, the organization and the task, and they are committed towards achieving those tasks. And then the individuals also have a lot of experience, so they show accountability, that if things go right or if things go wrong, then the accountability side of things also is taken care of within the organization. So here the model focuses on these three aspects when the team or members of the team are being put together. And you would generally see that in this case, it is very easy to look at, when I say easy, that means what I mean by that is that when you put members of the team together in a situation wherein they have to deal with a particular situation, you will generally see the skills, the accountability, and the commitment allows them to get through the tasks. And that is where they propose that in order to have teams which can take up challenges, you would need to have people within those teams which will have high skills. They'll have greater amount of commitment to the organization, and they are also accountable. That means they have a number of years of experience, which allows them to show accountability if things do not go right. Now, there are a number of other models that we can also cover in terms of looking at the team building model. So there is a GPRI model as well, which talks about goals, roles, procedures, and interpersonal relationship. This particular model is best suited when teams, when you see teams have lost their direction and they need to find a way back in order to, let's say, become more relevant, or, let's say when they want to be able to get back into the game. Now, sometimes you would see this particular model is employed in organizations which are specifically customer dealing or front-end customer dealing organizations, customer services, people within the sales team. What tends to happen is over the years, they have been performing in their role. The role becomes mundane. They know their role quite well. Every month, every quarter, they're given targets to achieve. And what they do is they utilize those processes and procedures which are within the organization, and to a certain extent use their interpersonal relationships to get the work done. Now, at some stage, what tends to happen is when organizations look at catapulting or basically looking at increasing, look at achieving increased goals or increased revenue, for example, in this case, you would see that in some cases, in those times, people would need to be put through this particular model is because they've been in that role for a number of years, have been performing, but if I have to get somebody to perform 100% and somebody to perform and deliver 150%, then in those cases you would require training. And sometimes what you will get to see is that in those cases, you will need to put together teams which understand, or individuals within those teams will understand the top goal of the organization. They understand their role quite well. They have been in that role for a number of years, and they are an authority in terms of their aspect of working. And you will also see that they understand companies' processes and policies quite well. So in those cases, and because of the number of years that they've spent in the organization, you would see that they have very good relationships with different people within the organization. So sometimes you would see that the GPRI model will be used to put together individuals in teams which will allow them to come together and achieve something far greater than what they would essentially end up doing, because of the fact that somehow over the years they've lost their way in terms of doing things or the way they do things. Now, there are lots of other models that we can discuss, but in general, when I look at a particular handout which I'll provide, they will have other models like the Larson model. We'll also talk about the Hackman model, the Lencioni model of team building. But from a relevant and theoretical point of view, most of these models have very good some sort of similarity with the Tuckman's building model, and also Dr. Belbin's model of team roles within the team building model. And the idea here is to primarily understand that why teams are important, and in some cases what kind of model or structure would work within a particular organization. Now, if we put this into context with understanding the culture, in terms of when we understand the organizational culture and what we've covered in Learning Outcome 2 in particular, what tends to happen is we see the organizational culture can be classified into different types. And these included the work which was done by 4 different people. So we covered Gert Hofstede model, we covered the Charles Handy Power Framework model, Jerry Johnson and Kevin Scholes, Adair's framework model, and the Edgar Schein's model. Now, when we talk about these frameworks which have come about over the years, which basically help us understand and define the culture within an organization, they are quite important, and we need to relate them to this particular aspect of essentially the reason why teams work within organizations, which can be used to improve effectiveness. So when we talk about these 4 models, I'm not going to go into detail at this moment because we've covered some of these in Learning Outcome 2, but just to refresh that these 4 scientists or philosophers essentially came up with these models after lots of studies which were done within the organization, and each of them proposed that when we look at their particular aspect of why they came up with this particular model was to basically ensure that when we talk about behavior, when we talk about the characteristics like personality and a character which people show within the organization, it overall actually influences and helps in the development of culture within the organization. So a set particular behavior, certain types of characteristics and behavior which the individual show, and then the sets of belief and values which the organization has shapes up the culture within the organization. And each of these slides basically puts a bit more detail into why do we see that they are important when we talk about effectiveness within the organization. Because if we look at one particular culture, when we talk about, say, Charles Handy's culture, power culture, he defined 4 dimensions: power, role, task, and person. And this particular aspect, if it is going to exist within the organization, would look at panning out in terms of the effectiveness and productivity, or the decision making power, and the where it rests within the organization would differ. So if it's a power culture, power is concentrated normally in the topmost management. If we see person culture, that means the individuals believe that we are more important than the organization, and you would generally see sometimes in such cases where when we talk about solicitor firms, accounting firms, partnerships, here they all come together because they are basically in the same profession, and each of them but brings different expertise. So somebody might be dealing in immigration, somebody might be dealing in company law, intellectual property, but they're working together as a team, and that is where person culture becomes important. So where we see this kind of ideology being applied with regards to the team building model, you would see different forms of effectiveness and performance, coming across in the organization. So here the idea is to try and understand primarily the aspect of how you would see teamwork important within the organization. And when we look at putting together teams, sometimes which models can be employed to bring in more effectiveness, and then how these models help out in overall the organization achieving effectiveness, and the culture being developed within the organization is what we need to cover in this task. So any questions on this so far?
Everything is understood. Thanks.
Okay, good stuff. Let's look at the last assessment criteria, which basically talks about, the processes and outcome of change that we talk about. And when we looked at initially in the first slide, talked about change models and why change is important. We discussed that changes sometimes are required to be done within the organization because people need to change, organization itself is changing, and in some cases we see new processes or policies being adopted within the organization because of competition, because of changes in the market structure, or in terms of the customer requirements. So when we talk about, the process of change, here we need to look at understanding one of the key, frameworks, which is called the, basically called the force field analysis. And this is one of the tools which is required to understand how change can be brought into the organization, if at all change is needed, and if change is needed, it is needed at what level, at the corporate level, at the operational level, or at the functional level. And this is where we need to look at one particular, video that I'm going to try and play, which basically looks at explaining, what is force field analysis.
Good grammar and spelling are important, but if you want to write essays that inspire, messages
when we have a tough decision, many of us write a list of the pros and cons. Then if we have more pluses than minuses, we should surely just go ahead with it. Well, not necessarily. If you've ever made one of these lists, you already know the problem. Most of the time, the pros and cons aren't equally important. For instance, you might just have 3 cons on your list, but one of them might be particularly significant. More so, even than all the pros you've listed. So it's hard to make a balanced decision with a simple list. One way around this is to use force field analysis. This technique helps you weigh up the forces for and against change and represent them in a visually clear way. Once you've done this, you'll have a more accurate assessment of your decision. Conducting a force field analysis is easy. Take a piece of paper and think about the decision you're making. On the left-hand side, list forces for change, that is the pros of the decision. On the right-hand side, list the forces against change, or the cons of the decision. Next, go through and assign a score of between 1 and 5 for each of the pros and cons. A score of 1 means that this element isn't that important. A 5 means it's very important. When you score the pros and cons on the diagram, you can represent the importance of each force by drawing arrows around them. Use bigger arrows for the forces that have greater influence on the change, and smaller ones for those that have less. Once you've done this, add up each column. You now know whether it's worth going ahead with the decision. You can find more about using force field analysis in the article that accompanies this video.
Right. So basically, if you see, sometimes when changes have to be implemented within the organization, what we have to do is look at using this particular framework, which was developed by, Kurt Lewin, and he basically proposed that sometimes when organizations undergo change or have to undergo change, the factors or variables which affect the change can be of different shape and size. That means they carry different weightage. And when we look at organizing them on this particular framework, you would normally look at rating them on a scale of 1 to 5, totaling them up, and that allows you to, come up with a score which basically says whether you should go for change or you should not go for change. And this then tends to inform more rationally that when managers and leaders look at implementing or bringing across bigger changes, they would use this as a particular framework to decide on whether this is, this is the right time to look at introducing the change, or is it not the right time to introduce a change. Now, I have looked at a very simple example of how to apply this framework is, if you're looking at buying a car, you're looking at buying a house, you're looking at buying something which is a high value ticket item, what you'll do is you'll list down your pros and cons, or basically your drivers and restraints in terms of why and what would be in favor of buying it, or what would be the factors which would be against buying that particular product, or in this case, a car or a house. And when you list down your pros and cons or your drivers and restraints or changes which would happen when you own that particular car, if you see which side, basically overpowers the other side, that will help you make a very rational decision. So if the restraints are higher, that means you're looking at higher payment. You could look at maybe organizing finance, but the interest costs are going to be too high. Your wife would not want it, or in this case, your old car is not paid off. Your job might not be too secure, or your kids are in college because they are priority. Then in those cases, the restraints are higher, and that would inform you of a decision that, okay, buying the car at this stage or changing or buying into and upgrading into a premium car might not be best solution, or the best way going forward in this case. So when we look at one of the things which on the strategic side tends to happen when we are looking at making decisions, and those challenging decisions which the managers and leaders have to make sometimes, what they will use is this framework called force field analysis to analyze and weigh the challenges or factors which are going to be affecting those let's say decision-making criteria, and coming across to a rational conclusion by rating them on a scale of 5, 1 to 5, and that would allow them to, clearly alienate the changes which are, or factors which are requiring change, and the factors which are, allowing them to avert that change or bring that change in the organization. Now, the other bits that we talked about when we look at this particular task that we are going to cover, which is analyze the process and outcomes of change for employee effectiveness, we touched on the initial aspects of what is called the balanced scorecard. So when we look at a balanced scorecard and when we look at performance management techniques, PMTs as we call it, there are lots of different ways through which performance can be measured. So it could be financial measurement, it could be non-financial parameters, it could be, you're looking at benchmarking against, say, competitor activity or market forces. And in some cases, when management look at, balanced scorecard, then they're looking at bringing pretty much all the facets of, looking at, say, what customers say, how the processes are being dealt with within the organization, how are the leaders and managers looking at building organizational effectiveness, and then the financial side of things, along with customers' feedback, would inform on, whether they are achieving their targets or not. So when we look at performance management techniques, they can be of various types. So in some cases, people would generally carry revenue targets, profit targets, market share targets, margin targets, and they would be typically financial. So at the end of the year, when they have their appraisals, you would generally see that their measurement is primarily done on the financial targets which the organization is banking on, or targets that they need to be able to hit, which the organization will bank on. Some of them tend to carry non-financial targets. So non-financial targets would be things like improvement in customer satisfaction score, improvement in the market share of the organization, or grabbing market share from your competitors. In those cases, those targets are going to be non-financial, improving the, so one of the financial target would be improving the share price of the company, and that could be a target for the board or the chief executive of the organization. And when we talk about non-financial targets, it could be for the service department, maybe the customer satisfaction score, which they need to improve on, and that could be a target. When we look at benchmarking, we are looking at basically benchmarking quality targets, the innovation and creativity side of things, which the company would normally look at, which is bringing out newer products, meeting customer demand by bringing out these products, and they would be looking at, benchmarking targets. Now, if I briefly look at a couple of other things, sometimes you talk about, CSF, and, you talk about KPIs or key performance index, and we talk about critical success factors. In those cases, those are also terms that we generally use when we talk about performance or measurement of how you've done across the year, or when an employee is performed across the year in terms of its roles and responsibility. So when we talk about CSF, they would be more management-led. When I say top management-led, when we talk about KPIs, they would be operational and functional management-led. And when we talk about targets, which are going to be financial, non-financial, they will be primarily, at the front-end employee end. Now, some of the other slides that I've covered is primarily talking about theoretically the change models that we need to focus on to understand, why change is important and why it needs to be implemented. So when we talk about the outcome of change, we need to know what change models are we talking about. So when we talk about the output of change, one of the models that we talk about is Levin's model, unfreeze, change, and refreeze. We talk about the Cotter's 8-step model of change, and they have been theoretically described, in terms of how these models work within the organization. And what I've done primarily is in one or two slides, you would see there are good articles which I've listed, which you need to go through, and they will provide you a practical example of how, some of these big four that we talk about, the consultancy firms, they look at implementing change within the organization, or when they are brought in during mergers and acquisitions, or during when large companies go into administration, you would see how they bring across change, reshape these companies, and bring them out of administration and liquidation would be the bits of examples that you would need to look at. And these subsequent slides explain that primarily with the example of, how changes are implemented. So for the Kurt-Lewin model of three-phase change, I've looked at an example of the Nissan Motor Company as an example, and how I've applied this change model is explained here. So when you see Nissan Motors, becoming, it went into bankruptcy, almost to the state of bankruptcy, You see Carlos Ghosn, which is the, who was the chairman and, president of Citroën and Renault in France. And he instituted the merger of the three organizations, Nissan Motors and Renault. And when you look at that, how he brought about that change could be reflected using, the Kurt Lewin's three-step model. We talk about the Cotter's 8-step model. So obviously he introduced a much detailed model to say that changes in organizations can be brought across by following these 8 steps. So it starts with building up an urgency, guiding the team, developing the vision. You look at basically creating a buy-in to that change first within the organization, which is a key differential from some of the other models. And then what you do is you empower the employees to start embracing that change, which looks at, working towards creating short-term gains or wins for the team so that they see the change is going to be beneficial for the organization. They follow it through, and then obviously towards the last, they make it stick by creating policies or amending policies and procedures which will allow that change to be embraced and become permanent in terms of the day-to-day functioning of the organization. And that is what has been explained, in these 8 particular slides. There are some advantages and disadvantages, and that has also been covered. And this would then help us wrap up learning outcome 3, which is primarily understanding the last bit, which is how change influences or change models can be applied and what kind of outcome they bring when they are implemented or used to implement and bring change within the organization. So any questions on this so far?
Everything is great. I understood everything. So
good stuff. So with this, I'm going to upload 2 particular handouts. One is going to be the handouts, these, the models of organizational learning. And the other handout would be on the team building model. And the third handout is going to be on the change models. So these 3 will be, helping you cover the theoretical aspects of what we've covered briefly with some of these slides today in the presentation, but they will provide some meat on the bones in terms of you doing or reading and developing some deeper knowledge into how these models have evolved, how they can be, employed and implemented within an organization, and some of the examples which will help clarify, the importance of these models in the aspect of, how organizations look at improving employee performance and building effectiveness in their day-to-day functioning in order to achieve goals. Is that okay?
okay. Yeah, that's perfect. I got both. Yeah.
Good stuff. So I'll catch up with you in the next session. And then this presentation is already up on Moodle and then
That's
the
great.
copy of the recording will go off shortly.
That is great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mr. Rahman.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for